All right, hey y'all. So, listen, I'm gonna be honest. This week kind of sucked. So we had to make some art about it. So I went back to a medium that I'm really comfy with, and that's watercolor. Okay, technically it's gouache and ink, but we're gonna talk about like what the difference between those are and if it even matters. Let's get into it. So I'm not really going to talk about how watercolor's made because I did a video about that when I did my acrylic paint video. And it's the same thing. It's pigment suspended in a medium, and this time the medium's water, so we've done it. I'll put a link to that video in the description, and so you can watch that if you want to. So now let's talk about the history of our medium. So according to Wikipedia, watercolor art dates back to cave paintings of Paleolithic Europe and has been used for manuscript illustration since at least Egyptian times. So that means like we've been like pigment and water apply for a while. We love it. We love to apply pigment to water. During the Renaissance is really when it became a more traditional medium where it was really like an accepted practice. And we can see these with like Albrecht Dürer, and he's one of our earliest examples of watercolor the way we think about it today. Whenever we talk about Renaissance art history, I feel like a lot of people's eyes glaze over, and I don't really think that's their fault. And at least in American public schools, it's really overemphasized, and they don't even really talk about the cool parts. So like one of my favorite Dürer pieces is his rhinoceros, and I'll put a picture here. He had never seen one. This drawing was based on descriptions told to him by other people, like a game of like garlic phone. And it looks like a rhino. He did great. And I think that's very cool. I also think in general it's not really emphasized how hard all of this art was to make, both like physically and mentally. So like you couldn't go buy pre-made watercolor, you had to make your own. You could not buy watercolor paper, you had to make your own. And also like we have these hundreds of years of art history to build upon when we make art, and that did not exist when they were doing this. I kind of think that this problem does extend past Renaissance art, because we can see that a lot with like abstract art and expressionism and stuff, because like, yeah, a rococo does just feel like a hotel art if you don't know the importance of it. And that doesn't mean that it's less of an art, and that doesn't mean that people who feel that way are dumb or anything. It's just, without that context, it becomes a lot less interesting. I also like in general though we are moving towards a more well-informed art history where we are really talking about things that are happening outside of the art world too, which I think is really nice. A more modern application of watercolor would be Georgia O'Keeffe works, which like I love her so much. I got to see some of her paintings in Dallas, maybe? I don't remember. I saw them with my partner. It was very fun. I really love this Evening Star painting. I don't know. I'm not really an abstract girly, but I really love this one. So that's the basic history of watercolor. Nothing crazy. We're gonna move on to gouache, which is technically what I use more. And when we get to the demo, you guys can really see the difference, but very briefly, gouache and watercolor are really similar. Same pigments, binders, and formulation, except for gouaches tend to be much more opaque than a watercolor. That's why a lot of times people will do a gouache wash, which I think is very fun to say. And so you'll dilute the gouache and put it over a piece of paper and then build on it. And that's pretty much the big difference. The biggest thing is I think how people use them, because people tend to use gouache more like a acrylic paint, very thick, very opaque, and people tend to use watercolor more washes of color. Again, not like a hard and fast rule, but in general. All right, we've talked about what watercolor is. We've talked about its friend, gouache, and what the difference is. So let's talk about gouache's history. So gouache came about in about the 16th century, according to Cass Art, because people would put oil paint over tempera to give it a matte finish. And then pastel paintings, this would be used over it too. And then it slowly got it added to more common watercolor kits, if that makes sense. All right. So we got Durer and O'Keeffe for our watercolor, who are gonna be our gouache girlies. So a lot of artists use gouache, like our very problematic fave, Picasso. I want to talk a little bit about one of my other problematic faves, Egon Schiele. He was a expressionist painter, and his paintings are so intense and raw and sexy. Like, I don't know if I'll actually be able to put any of his pictures in this video because they're so sexual. I've always found them really, really powerful, and the way that he does forms to be so interesting. But I do want to talk about that, like, with a lot of art, it can be hard to separate the artist from it. And I don't think I'm gonna like fully talk about whether or not, you know, if an artist is a bad person, does that mean we don't get to enjoy their art? I don't know. I might make a video about it one day. I know there's already like a million of them out there, but I love to yap. But anyways, going back to the point is, like, there's a lot of debate if he was a predator or not, because he would draw young children nude, and he was arrested for seduction and abduction, but then he just got charged with having the drawings accessible to children. And so it's like, with some things, it's a lot easier to look at it and be like, okay, yes, this person did things that are bad. Does that mean we shouldn't consume their art anymore? And I think that's an important debate to have, to figure out where your personal line is. Like, you know, you gotta figure it out. But then it gets even harder when it's like not proven. And so like, it's like, okay, yeah, you got charged for being weird, but like, was it bad? I don't know. And this is not like a justification of anything. It's just more like, things are complicated and nuanced, and we know that he had mental health issues and was suffering from a lot of like other stuff. So like, does it matter? I don't know. Anyways, this is kind of just, this is supposed to be about watercolor, by the way. This is just, I think, kind of getting the seed started that art versus the art is really complicated, and that I really enjoy some problematic faves. Might make a video about it. Let's move on back to gouache and watercolor. We're gonna switch over to my desk and we're gonna do a demo. But yeah, let me know what y'all think. Let me know if y'all are hardliners, and if a person sucks, we don't support them at all. Can the art be worth suffering? I don't know. Let me know. All right. Outro time. All right. Hello. Welcome to the demo portion. Before we get started on the how to actually do watercolor, what I wanted to talk about first was paper. Because so with a lot of mediums, you can kind of get away with doing whatever you want. And that's true with watercolor too, but you will have the best chance of success if you are using the correct paper. So if you use something like regular sketching paper, and you can tell like I've used watercolor in this sketchbook, but you can tell that it is really destroying the paper. So this is just too thin, it's too smooth, it will not work well with watercolor. And again, you can do whatever you want, but you're gonna have a much higher chance of success if you use watercolor paper. You don't need to buy the most expensive watercolor paper you can find, especially if you're a beginner. But I would recommend trying a couple different types. These are all scraps, so they have a lot of different like paint on them already. But you can see how this has a lot of texture in it and how it gives the paint a nice textured finish versus something a little bit more smooth like this paper. And you can see that it gives us a lot smoother finish. There's a bunch of different kinds of paper. I'm gonna put a link of somebody who wrote like literally a huge article about their favorite kinds of paper. In general, there's hot press, cold press, and like handmade paper. Hot press tends to be smoother than cold press. The watercolor paper can be super expensive. Ask around, see if somebody else has paper you can borrow first. And just play. See what works for you and what watercolors or gouache you have. Other tools that you'll probably want for watercolor, and these are not like hardcore, you have to get them or you'll perish. Washi tape, whatever kind you got, it can really help you hold your paper flat so it doesn't curl as you get it wet. You can block off sections, you can do like paint over the washi tape and peel it for clean lines. So get some washi tape. Paper towels for two reasons. One, you'll have a lot of water, so just in case you spill. But you can also use this as an actual tool, so you can use it to pick up extra watercolor from your paper. You can use this to wipe your brush off to make sure you're not putting too much water on the paper as you work. So just some paper towels, just in case. A tool that also is really nice is a hair dryer or a tool specifically made for drying watercolor. I don't recommend using a heat gun because heat guns can get hot enough to catch paper on fire. Ask me how I know. Then you'll also want brushes. Mostly watercolor is pretty forgiving. You can use pretty much whatever brushes you want. Natural bristles will give you a little bit smoother finish or like a higher quality synthetic. I would stay away for the most part of like brushes that are really rough. You'll get a really streaky finish and maybe that's what you want, but in general, smoother, softer brushes. Also, don't judge me for my brushes. I know they need some love. Maybe we'll do a brush care video, we'll see. And cheap synthetics, like this is like super cheap plastic. This probably won't hold water as well as you want, so I would lean towards, you know, a nice, either a really nice synthetic or a actual like bristle brush. It'll hold water a lot better than plastic. You can also buy different materials, so like sponges work really well for adding watercolor texture. Talked about paper towels, but like there are a lot of different options. Oh, I'm so mean to my paintbrushes, I'm so sorry, y'all. Alright. You will also need a thing to hold water. This is a very limited edition, super expensive watercolor water holder. The biggest thing is you need to make sure it is very distinct from what you are drinking out of, so you do not drink your paint water. Watercolors tend to not be as toxic as things like acrylic or oil paints. We still don't want to drink them. So something very different from what you are drinking out of, or a lid. Don't drink your paint water. You might also want to get a spray bottle. This one says vodka because this is normally what I use to clean costumes with. I took the vodka out and put water in it, but I'm gonna put the vodka back in. This is a very like, I think this was like $6 for a fancy mister. You can get a dollar store plastic one, that's fine. I don't know where mine go. I have bought so many tiny spray bottles and they just vanish. So we're using my costume one. You don't need this. You can use a straw. You can use a crunched up paper towel. A mister is nice to activate your paints though, or to get your paper evenly wet. Not needed, but nice. I also, as you can tell, I'm a big proponent of scratch paper to work on while you work with your painting. You can do this on a reusable palette, you can do this on a paper towel. I like using watercolor when I'm mixing paint so I can really see exactly what it is and how it's going to respond to the paper. And then like you can obviously use the same piece of paper a bunch of different times. You don't have to. You can use a palette, you can use a paper towel, you can use cheap paper. This is just something I like to do and I've seen other people do. I also recommend using a wax-based colored pencil for sketching instead of a pencil. And that is because, let me get something that has a lot of white space. So if I draw something like this in a watercolor pencil, it's wax, so once it gets wet, it won't smudge. Versus if I use like a regular pencil, which I own, there we go, and it gets wet, it can smudge. And it's also a regular colored pencil will be a little bit more forgiving to cover up with color, and a pencil won't, especially like a light color, like a yellow or something. You can do it, lots of people do. A wax-based colored pencil will just work better. Mostly. Again, unless you want the smudge. If you want the smudge, go for it. Okay, so those are all the tools we need. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the different watercolors and gouache that I have, because I have a couple different kinds. So one of the most common watercolors that you'll have, and you can see these are a bunch of different price points because I enjoy watercolor of all types, will be a dried pan. So these can start, this one's very common. This is like a little bit nicer than like a little kid set. You can tell that I really like the white though, which is why I use gouache a lot. When you have your colors like this, so we have very cheap watercolors and then nice watercolors. Nice just means that they are more pigmented. Ignore the dust, it's part of my ceiling. Please see, we're having a rough week. These all work roughly the same. What you're gonna do is you're gonna get them wet and then take the pigment and apply them to the paper. You can also get watercolor in tubes, or anything that's actually watercolor. All my tubes might be gouache if I'm being honest. Oh no, this one's watercolor. And so easy. So tiny. These you put onto probably a palette or your scrap paper. Maybe get them wetter if you want. These are just a little bit wetter than these. You probably won't directly apply these to your paper that you're working on for real, but you could if you wanted to. So they come in tubes. You can also get, I don't use these a lot, I have them. So you can get watercolor pencils. So these are pretty much like these, but in sticks. These are cool and you can do stuff with them. I don't use them a lot. And then I have some very fun handmade watercolors that I bought at an art market. And again, these are just like the pan ones like we saw before. You can also use crayons to do wax resist. This one was specifically made to resist, so there's no color and it's a higher wax content. So like you can do this, and then once we do some colors, you'll see that the watercolor won't stick to this, which is pretty cool. You could also use that to create layers. You could use that to protect your pencil under drawing. It's all good. I'm saying if I have anything else cool in here besides Orient Mead. So pretty. So those are the watercolors that I have and I use. I do also have gouache, and gouache comes in pretty much the same forms. So you can get tubes like this, or you can get, this is so popular. Also mine are very, very dried out. So they're supposed to look a lot more jelly-like than this. I'm bad. Also, this is so popular on the internet for such a long time. And I'll say, like, I really like it. I use it a lot. I don't know if I'm ever gonna like go through all of this paint, but I do use it a lot and I enjoy it. So that's the gouache and watercolor. I'm just going to use these 2 palettes and put everybody else away. Drink out our paint water. Find a nice big white spot. Oh, I want to show you guys that. That's okay, we'll get the crayon back out. Yeah, start here. So there are 2 main techniques when it comes to watercolor. Sorry, I'm trying to find that crayon so I can show you guys the wax resist. There it is. I'm just gonna draw a little squiggle like that. There's wet on wet and wet on dry. So what that means is, are we going to apply the watercolor on dry paper or on wet paper? When the paper is dry, we can have more vivid colors and more control over where the color goes. Wet on wet makes blending a lot easier, but it can be harder to maintain details and separation. In general, there are other rules, but we don't care about those. Step 1 for best watercolor application is to activate your watercolors first. So you just apply a little bit of water. We'll go with the blue section. Normally you want to, oh, I oversprayed all my technology, oops. Normally you want to let this sit for a little bit, but I'm impatient, so bear with us. You don't have to do this step, like if you were in a rush and you're just like, I gotta paint right now. But it can really help the watercolors be easier to work with. So let's do wet on dry first, because that'll be easier to see, and then we will do wet on wet. So I'm gonna take my brush, I'm gonna get it wet, and I'm gonna pick a color. We'll do this nice green. So this little palette is watercolor and the big palette is gouache. Okay, and then I can just apply the color to the paper, and then you can see right there, there's the little the water resist stripe right here, so that's zigzag. And so we can see that the color is pretty intense. It's pretty easy for me to do hard edges. But if I wanted to do something like blend, like let's say this blue, and I wanted to blend this blue in, like kind of really have to work it to get it to blend out. And you can see that we have a hard edge here. So again, just depends on what you want. Then we can clean our brush. I like to put a lot of water in so I don't have to change my water out, but live your best life. With the gouache, we do pretty much the same thing. I'm gonna pick this green down here. We go like that. And again, pretty same results. Once these dry though, this will have a little bit more of a matte finish and the watercolor might be a little shinier. Just depends on which ones you're using. You can have opaque gouache, you can have opaque watercolor, just depends. But we can see they're pretty similar. And again, if I go to try to like blend that with a different color, actually the gouache does behave a little bit better with this kind of blend. But we can see that it's still a little harsh of a line, but it's nice. So that's wet on dry. Watercolor wet, apply to dry paper. The next one is wet on wet. So this just means we get the watercolor paper wet. Not soaked, but just damp. You could use the spray bottle, you could use a straw. I'm just using like one of these like cheap paintbrushes that come with sets. And so now when we do the colors, so we go back over here into this green. See how it's a lot softer of a color and the edges are a lot more diffused? That's what the effect gives us of doing the wet on wet. And then we can see if we go into blend, we just get a lot softer graduation of color, which I think is very nice. Wet on wet also allows you to do different techniques too. Like I was talking about earlier, you could take your paper towel and lift some of the color. I'm gonna do it a little hotter and fresher really quick. So you can lift some of the color with a paper towel. And then that can just give you a bunch of different effects and textures, which I think can be very nice. And then we'll do the wet on the gouache. I kind of want more water. This paper's thirsty. I'm gonna do more water. And then we take the gouache, we apply it. In general, the gouache will not be as flowing as watercolor. But that's not like a hard and fast rule. And then we can blend again with the gouache. So pretty. I think that looks really nice. And so that's what the gouache looks like on the wet on wet technique. And you can see that they behave a little differently, but relatively similar. So this is all well and good, but like how do I make layered things I think can be really hard in watercolor. Let me use this one right here. So when you are layering with watercolor, you can use wet on wet or wet on dry. Wet on wet will take a little bit longer, but you'll have more blending. So it just depends. So we're gonna use a little bit of a different brush, a little flat floofity brush. He's a 1/4 inch scruffy. That's what his name is. So we'll get him wet. And then I'm gonna do like the world's quickest like mountain range, because I think that's a really easy way to show depth. So I'm gonna take a nice dark color. I'm doing wet on dry. I'm gonna do, oh my goodness, what a beautiful mountain range. Wow, we are so good at art. So now that this first layer of our beautiful, beautiful mountain painting is done, if we tried to go over it, I'm gonna add some more water just so it really illustrates my point. We could get some cool effects for sure. Like I wanna like add some like, you know, some shading. Like that looks really nice. Yeah, wow, so beautiful. But now if I tried to like draw another shape over this, it would be pretty hard. Oh, I think I just rubbed my face with color. My fucking phone ran out of storage. Okay, so I was talking about how if I tried to do everything while it was still wet, the shapes would be really hard to see. So I actually did one more layer that it didn't record. But that's okay, because now this is really dry. So now we could take this and we could add even another shape. So I'm gonna take some greens and we're gonna add some grass. Wow. And we can see our beautiful grass. The big thing when you're layering with watercolors, anything that you want to have a really clear shape cannot be over something wet. Otherwise it'll just kind of all blend together and be hard to see. And that's the same thing goes for gouache. Now we're gonna switch to my painting. I had a rough week. We worked through it with our art. And then I will be right back. y'all. I have some other things. Numero uno, should I make my own watercolors? Do we think that'd be a fun video? Second thing, Lowe's paint guy, I hate you. After looking at the living laundry room for so long, I've decided that I can't stand looking at the beige anymore, and I can't stand being an adult. So I'm painting my laundry room neon black light hot pink. Maybe I'll film it and post it. But that's it. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I will see y'all in the next one. Bye.